Hello and welcome to West Country Wanderings. Welcome to another one of my canal series and also a return to my Secrets of the Stroudwater series. Today I've returned to Chippenham Platt, sometimes known as Chipman's Platt. Take your pick. I don't think anybody knows the origin of either or. But Chippenham or Chipman's Platt, which has been the subject of much restoration over the past few weeks, and it's somewhere we're going to be returning to in the new year when I bring you the next update on the Cotswold canals. But it's not about the immediate restoration as the subject of our video today. We're going way back in time, way back in fact to the 1720s indeed, long before even the American Civil War, long time ago. So about 300 years ago. 300 years ago, there were nine men known as the Undertakers, and they had plans to build something here on the edge of the town of Stroud in the Froome Valley in Gloucestershire. So I hope you can join me again for another Secrets of the Stroudwater. And who were these mysterious 9 Undertaker men? Now, the building of the Stroudwater Canal here in Gloucestershire came about because of an Act of Parliament, as canal constructions usually do. But this particular act, the Stroudwater Act of 1775, came about because of a dispute which actually ended up in Gloucester Assizes in 1730. It also involved scuffles between the canal navvies and the local landowners and mill owners. But why? How did this all begin? Well, we need to go back to the 1720s and the reasons why they needed to build a canal, a length of navigation from the River Severn into the heart of the Stroud Valleys, which is about 6 miles to the east of me here. Oh, this incidentally is the section which is now in water with dock lock there. I did cover this previously on another Secrets of the Stroudwater, looking at the dry dock there. If you want to check that one out, have a look at the canal series. In fact, I'll probably link to it at the end of this one. Now, the reason for the Stroudwater navigations and the ones that we couldn't before it, which we've touched on a couple of times here on West Country Wanderings, and I'll mention them a little bit more again because it's all part of our big story here. It's to do with the price of coal. Now, the mill owners needed coal. They needed coal to power their machinery. They also need other things as well, which we'll also mention. The coal was coming from the Shropshire coalfields. In fact, you'll know where precisely if you saw my last Geopark Way video, because I finished that in the village of Highley, where there is was a large coalfield which closed in the 1960s. Remember, I said in that video it went across the River Severn on cables hung across the river itself before they would later replace it by a bridge, I think in the 1930s. So the coal needed to come from that area of the River Severn, down the River Severn, bearing in mind there were no other canals in existence at that time, hazardous journey, to either be landed at either Gloucester or Framelode, which is where the present day Stroudwater meets the Stroudwater, or the River Severn itself, shall I say. One of the bargemen from Shropshire was a gentleman called Edward Owen. Now, he actually charged the sum of 11 shillings to land coal at Framelode. But by the time it got to Stroud, it was selling for 19 shillings a tonne. So some big difference. And it was because of that additional cost of 8 shillings, which was of course because of the land transport costs between Framelode and Stroud, that meant the cost in Stroud itself was a lot higher. Now, if only the mill owners had some means of bringing the cost of the coal down, which would then increase the profit of their output. How could they do that? Well, of course, it meant using a canal navigation instead of the unreliable roads, which were terrible. We think they're bad now with potholes here in Gloucester and across the wider West Country, but they were really bad then, particularly in times of heavy rain. And there was costly breakages of wheels on carts and that. So it meant that land transport cost was high. So these men, these 9 men, these were wealthy men. Some of them were mill owners themselves, but they also had investment interests, were thinking money, 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 profit. Get the cost of the coal landing in Stroud down. How can we do that? Replace the road with waterway, a canal. If we do that, the cost in Stroud will be cheaper and our profits will go up. So far, so good. Now this group of 9 men interested in reducing the price of coal were known collectively as the Undertakers. Maybe they just dressed in black all the time. I don't think anybody really knows, but that was their nickname. And they approached a gentleman called John Hoare, who had previously been responsible for making navigable the River Avon through Bath and also the River Kennett in Berkshire. This is before the Kennett and Avon Canal had been built. So he had some history in making rivers navigable, and their original concept was not to build a continuous new canal, but to navigate or make navigable sections of the River Frome as it goes from the River Severn, or where it enters the River Severn, back that way towards the town of Stroud. Now it wasn't just coal that they thought that would help or be helped by this new waterway. The price of coal they'd actually worked out could be reduced to as cheap as 15 shillings a tonne, thereby saving 4 shillings for landing in Stroud. But they could also move malt and grain and food supplies for the many workers which then needed to support all of the mills springing up in the Stroud valleys. So there was additional cost savings to be had elsewhere for those raw materials. And of course they could then use this waterway to export the goods they were making from the mills, particularly like the clothiers, could then get them up to market in the West Midlands and further into the north. So there were lots of opportunities, lots of ways to improve productivity and increase profit. John Hoare actually said that it could be done for £20,000 by using 12 locks between Framalode and Stroud, and that is what they decided to go ahead with. Now John Hoare's scheme was actually for an entire separate waterway, and the reason he didn't want to use the River Frome was to make sure that they satisfied the needs of the mill owners by not disturbing the flow along the River Frome itself, which provided water power for the mill owners. So an act was passed, and it got through on the 26th of May 1730, the Stroudwater Act. However, there's always a however, isn't there? There were 9 mill owners that were not happy. And although construction had only barely started, there was a big row between the 9 mill owners and the 9 Undertakers. Now there were lots of clauses within that act which was trying to get round how it would, or rather would not, affect the mill owners. But they still weren't happy with these clauses. And because of the row, no further work progressed on building the first Stroudwater Canal. Of course, that's not the end of our story, because if you've seen a couple of previous Secrets of the Stroudwater, you'll know that there were 2 more attempts to build a canal here before the one we have here today. The next one was Richard Owen, who was a poet, and he was also extremely wealthy, and he'd purchased Whitminster House about a couple miles to the west of where I currently am. And he decided to have a private scheme, in effect a canal leisure water park for all the wealthy people that attended his big balls, galas and parties. Indeed, no less than the Prince of Wales visited his canal, the Cambridge Canal, nothing to do with Cambridgeshire way over there in the east of England, but his canal, which went from Framalode right to his estate at Whitminster. And we saw that in the episode looking at Cambridge Canal, and how sections of the River Frome are still, you can see them still straightened as they go around Westminster House. So the legacy of that second attempt is still there. It was short-lived, however, and of course it closed down. It never was intended to carry any freight, never did. It was just a purely leisure thing. I think he got tired of it in the end, and it closed and it gradually just silted up, and the magnificent gardens went into decay, although his name does crop up in the records of the Stroudwater Canal Company later on when the proper one was undertaken. But in order to get to that one, we had another one. The next scheme, depends which one you're counting from now, it's either the second scheme or the third scheme, if you include the 9 Undertakers original scheme, was one by John Dalloway. Now, John Dalloway was a wealthy clothier merchant from the village of Brimscombe, which is a village a couple miles east to the town of Stroud, which also sits right on the River Frome. So yes, he had interests as well. Now, he employed the services of 3 men. Curiously, they were all called Thomas. Can you believe that? One was called Thomas Chin, another one was a gentleman called Thomas Bridge, who was from Tewkesbury. He was a millwright, and also Thomas Yeoman. Now, Thomas Yeoman has got connections to our present day Stroudwater Canal. The 3 of them devised a plan, and that plan was, well, very different to the original one, the Undertakers scheme, where they used the gentleman called John Hoare that had been on the navigable section of the River Avon. And this new scheme would have had 14 pound locks and 2 flash locks. But also it was going to be using sections of the River Frome to make them navigable. Again, so it's like a combination of the early one, the one that comes later, which is the Kemmett one, which we'll mention again in a minute, but also pulling on the experience of the first one. Again, it was to try and mitigate the mill owners, to appease them, if you like, to placate the waters. So what happened to Dalloway's scheme? Now, construction did start on Dalloway's scheme, although we don't think there are any remains of his scheme today, because probably what happened, the later edition of the Stroudwater, the one that you can see the section of here at Chipman's Plat, have probably obliterated his work. But yes, you guessed it, he came up against problems with the mill owners yet again, and his scheme was finally abandoned just 4 years after it had started, and I don't think any item of freight was ever carried upon it. The 4th scheme is one we've devoted an entire video to about before. In fact, it was the very first Secrets of the Stroudwater, and that was the Kemmett Canal. One gentleman called John Kemmett with 3 other businessmen, mainly from the Tewkesbury and Worcester areas, got together to devise a scheme. Now, their scheme was simply ingenious. An act was passed in 1759 to start construction, very different to what had gone before. He proposed using the River Frome to strengthening it, making it navigable, but to get round the mill owners' problem, he decided to use a system of cranes. So you'd have one section of the River Frome, another section there, and have a crane lift out the freight, coal, whatever it was, in containers. It was the first use of containers on a transportation system anywhere in the entire world. Absolutely fantastic, superly ingenious. Only problem was it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Well, if you go back to think about the original need for a navigation system here, it was to reduce the cost of coal going into Stroud, and other goods as well, of course. And they were looking for a saving around about 5 shillings. But because of the increased transportation costs with lifting goods out, putting them in again into another barge, and then doing the same process again at the next mill, I think there was a series of about 6 or 7 times, so this would have happened several times between Framalode and Stroud. It meant the costs were prohibitive, and it completely meant there were no cost savings to be had by the time the freight got to Stroud. Well, in fact, Kemmett's canals, we know from that video, and again I'll link to that one if you haven't seen that, meant that that scheme never happened completely. He did build, or in combination with the engineers, sections of it from Framlode right through to the edge of the town of Stonehouse. But yeah, it serves as a reminder of a particularly fantastic piece of engineering and innovation, but sadly not a great business model. However, the problem remained. The raw goods going into Stroud and to get the goods out again was expensive, to get them to the navigable River Severn by using road transport because of the awful road network. Does that sound familiar? And the opening of the Droitwich canals and the Staffs and Worcester canals, again, canals I've covered previously here on West Country Wanderings. You'll find them in the canals playlist if you want to have a look at those. They opened in the early 1770s and word got down, falling down from the River Severn, of course, and for another connection which we'll talk about in a future Secrets of the Stroudwater, because of the big connection between the Stroudwater and the town of Bewdley. It's huge. Watch on for that one in the new year. There were an impetus. So the businessmen got together again, meeting at the George, a pub in the town of Stroud in 1774, to see how they could have a fifth attempt, a final push to get navigation through along the Froome Valley and connect it up the town of Stroud to the River Severn. So that's exactly what happened. Well, after that meeting in Stroud, things happened really quickly. They managed to raise some £20,000 in capital in a short period of time. In fact, on the 30th of May 1775, the first stone was cut at Framlode to build the quay there and the joining of the new canal to the River Severn. So you think everything's going to be plain sailing and we have our new canal. But sadly, not so. The reason for that, they decided to build it not by obtaining a new act, but the original 1730 act, which we talked about at the beginning of this video. But why was that an issue? Now, the gentleman who devised this fifth and final scheme of the Stroudwater, the route of the Stroudwater navigation, was one Thomas Yeoman, who we have previously come across in this video under Dalloway's scheme. So he designed the route. We'll touch on the route at the end of this video as well, because it's of interest as it goes through here at Chippenham's Plat. But the issue was, his design was for an entirely new waterway. No utilisation of the River Froome whatsoever. However, the 1730 Act was for a series of new cuts to the River Froome, making sections of it navigable. That was not the case with Thomas Yeoman's scheme. The landowners protesteth much. In fact, they hired groups of local thugs to go over and attack the canal navvies that were building this new Stroudwater Canal. There was lots of scuffles, eventually ending up in Gloucester Assizes, yes again. And it all came to a head. It meant that the people, the shareholders that raised capital for the Stroudwater had to go back to Parliament to have a bill go through Parliament to pass a new Stroudwater Act, which is exactly what happened. The new canal bill for the Stroudwater went through the Parliament, the Houses of Parliament, in the winter of 1775, reaching a royal assent on the 25th of March 1776. The canal was completed to Chippenham's Plat here in January of 1778, and it got through to Stroud on 25th of March 1779. However, his scheme, Thomas Yeoman's scheme, tried to appease the landowners as much as possible, this new scheme, and he chose his route very, very carefully. Now, you perhaps wonder why the present-day Stroudwater, the line of it, obviously now a lot of it is in water apart from our missing mile, is some distance away from the River Froome. The River Froome is actually, probably about a quarter of a mile behind me. So why the difference? The reason for having it close to a river is because it reduces the costs and you need less lifts and locks and time, of course, to get boats through the canal if it has to go up less gradient. But as I say, he wanted to appease the landowners, and here the reason was Easington Court. Easington Court is about a quarter mile that way. I think might be one of their driveways here, which runs down in that direction, takes you to an orchard. Easington Court is nearby. It is a private estate still. And there was a gentleman there called Ellis, and he was completely against any form of navigation because it brought in navvies and working class people to the area. He just wanted his slaves to work on his own land and not bring in riffraff from elsewhere. So he was completely opposed to the scheme, didn't want to see any canal, and it meant that the canal needed to be further to the north than the River Frome, and it also meant increased costs because it had to be on an embankment, which is most notable going past St Sire's Church in the town of Stonehouse, where it's raised up above the floodplain of the River Frome. So yes, that final appeasement, because he didn't want his scheme, which would have been the fifth time to reopen or get this opened to the town of Stroud, to appease all the landlords in the area. But they got there eventually. I hope you've enjoyed the secrets of the Stroud Water along a section of the Stroudwater Canal, which is currently undergoing restoration, and more on the story of that in a new update number 18, which will follow on in the new year 2025 here on West Country Wanderings. Please let me know what you thought. Until next time on the channel, take care of yourselves, look after yourselves, and I hope to see you on the channel again very, very soon. All the best for now. Cheers. Goodbye.